Good afternoon. This is the Devar Torah on Parashat Va'eira, and this is the second Parsha of the Sefer Shemos, Exodus, that deals with the actual beginning of the liberation of Bnei Israel and rescuing the Jews from Egyptian domination, and there's going to be their liberation. It begins with a lecture by God to Moshe, because at the end of last week's Parsha, he said, what's the point of sending me? It's just made matters worse. Now, for Moshe to speak that way was disrespectful and was becoming a little too familiar with God. And then he explained that I made a note to your forefathers, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, that you're going to get the land. And he said, they didn't know my name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is the name of Hashem's mercy. It's the name with which Hashem created the whole universe. And even though they were familiar with the term, the name, literal name, they did not realize its full meaning. They knew him as Shaddai, different name. And then after that, there's a whole genealogy of the tribes of Reuben and Shimon, and then of the Levium, explaining how Moshe and Aaron came to be about. And it ends and it says, as it goes through the whole genealogy, and this is the Moshe and Aaron that are going to speak to Pharaoh. Pharaoh is given a number of opportunities before the first plague even. Moshe and Aaron go to him, show him the signs. One is the staff, which was originally Adam Arishon's staff, turns into a snake. The Egyptian magicians can do the same thing. And Hashem strengthens Pharaoh's heart. Not that he toughened his heart, but what he did instead was not allow Pharaoh to be scared by the so-called terror factor of that and the forthcoming plagues, so he could do what he really wanted. Hashem was given the opportunity to follow his own desires, and that was going to lead to consequences. This is why Pharaoh was able to withstand the first 9 plagues and refused to let Hashem's people go. And the Parsha then, and the other 2 symbols that are given, Moshe shows the one with leprosy. Then there's one for a forecast of what's to come. He takes water, and as it pours out of a container, it turns into blood. But Pharaoh ignores it, even though he sees that some kind of miracles going on here. But since his magicians can duplicate it, and to explain the reason they could duplicate it, at least the first couple of plagues, is because they were able to go into the powers of tap into the powers of Chuma, impurity. In fact, they were so prevalent in Egypt that even 3-year-olds knew how to perform simple acts of using the black forces. It's sometimes incorrectly translated as magic, but they were able to perform certain events and even so-called miracles doing that. The Parsha then goes on to describe the first 6 plagues. Briefly, those 6 plagues are Dam, which is blood, Svedea, frogs, Kinim, lice, Arav is wild animals, Dever is pestilence, Shkeen is boils, and the final one in this week's Parsha is Barad, which is hail. Now, to briefly look into each one, look into those. I'll be coming back to the plague of Dam a little later in more detail. Each one of those, as we see, is Mida Keneged Mida, which means measure for measure against what the Egyptians did. both against God and against his people, were going to be paid back. And one question that, of course, is raised is why 10 plagues? Hashem could have just done the first 10th plague, Malchus Bechorim, the killing of the firstborn, that would have been it. But this is to show Hashem's true kingship and that he is running the world, which I'll have more to say about shortly. And one or two interesting things to notice. In the case of shkin, boils, for example, Hashem made the opposite. Most boils are either wet, some of them are dry, they're either very itchy, very irritating. God made both of them at once, and imposed it on the Egyptians, including Pharaoh, at once. Because they were able to do that, there was no cure for them for the time of the plague. And now Barad was an interesting one. That was hail, except it's not hail as we understand it, because our hail is dry pellets of ice. Here, they were a combination. They were ice mixed with fire. Now, obviously, fire and water can combine, and that was one of the miracles, which shows that our natural laws are only those based because God allows them, but he can alter the laws if he needs to, and in that case, he did. This time, the Egyptians were given a choice. They could have very simply followed what God said, if you take your animals in, they'll be safe. If the people go in with them, they'll be safe. Some Egyptians were starting to get a concept that God is all-powerful and took their animals in. A number didn't, so those animals all died, and also all the crops, the early crops of the year, were wiped out by the hail. And interestingly enough, when Moshe went out of the city, because he couldn't ask in the city because of all the idols and impurity, some of the hail stopped up in Shemayim in heaven. And what's really going to happen to the rest of that hail is going to be at the time of the ultimate redemption. When Mashiach comes, that hail is going to come down and wipe out all the Rishoyim, the special hail of fire and cold. Now, I would like to focus on the question of the Makos. Now, the concept of Makos, to understand their context, which of there's 10 plagues, one has to look back. When Hashem created the world, he created it with 10 sayings. First one being Rivshed Elokim Shemayim Varetz, beginning of Hashem's creation of the heavens and the earth. The last one, going down in descending order, the last one being let us make man and woman made he them, they, and was made in Selim Elohim in God's image, had an immortal soul. And the world at that time could have simply stopped at the point of Adam and Chava hadn't eaten from the fruit on the 6th day. It's a Dasatov tree of good and evil. The whole human race would have stayed in Gan Eden, and history as we know it would not happen. Of course, they ate from the fruit. Now, then God gave the human race in its entirety 20 generations to redeem their potential. The first 10 were Adam to Noah. What did that end up in? That ended up in the flood, which wiped out all humans, animals, and plant life, and had to be a full restoration of the earth. The next 10 generations started with Noah and went down to the Tower of Babel, Migdal Babel, when the world, all the people in the world living in one valley had one language. They could have served Hashem properly. What did they do instead? They built a tower, and they said they're going to go in war with God in heaven. That's when the 70 languages were made, because people couldn't talk to each other outside of their own family groups, and they went off. And then they did what was originally intended, was to populate the whole planet. Now, therefore, it was determined that the human race had hit such a low level that God decided to have one people lead the development and ultimate redemption, and that was Jewish people, with starting with Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and their wives, and children and grandchildren, and that was the nucleus of that people. Now, Abraham, interestingly enough, also had connected to the number 10 tests. Now, what did these 10 tests have to occur? These 10 tests had to occur because mankind needed to be developed. Each one of those tests helped elevate the human race. Therefore, they're viewed in reverse order to the 10 sayings. So the first test of Abraham, according to at least the list of Pirkei Rav Eliezer, is testing, is hiding out from Nimrod, who was the ruler of most of the world then, and he had been one who had instigated the Tower of Babel, Migdal Babel, and he and that was Abraham's first test. He was able to hide out because he'd come to a knowledge of one God, and the astrologers of Nimrod predicted there'd be his child, one who would been ultimately overthrown. In some ways, a parallel to the story later of Moshe, Pharaoh. In any event, those 10 tests elevate him. So the first test, let us make man, was equivalent to Hashem, was equivalent to Abraham hiding in the cave after having discovered Hashem, true understanding of God. And that true understanding of God, is equivalent to the expression of let us make man and woman, because that was the real purpose of the human race. And so then going upwards, the 10th test of Abraham would be binding Yitzhak and be willing to sacrifice him at Hashem's request. And that's equivalent to Bereshit, Bara Elokim Shemayim Va'aretz. That in other words, our whole purpose in life is to serve Hashem. Everything is Hashem, living for Hashem, God, and if even necessary, giving up one's life, dying al Kiddush Hashem. Now, Abraham and his descendants became elevated, and then what happened is the Jewish people descended into Egypt as part of God's divine plan, and they sank to the 49th level of spiritual impurity. And Pharaoh and the powers of purity that he represented, they were the super power of their day, which had partially been done by Yosef's helping to build up Pharaoh during the fast and transferring most power to him. In any event, the whole world was stuck in the forces of impurity. Most of Hashem's people, plus the Egyptians and the world as a whole. So again, there had to be another reawakening paralleling the one with Abraham. They had to be shown, both Bnei Israel, Hashem's people, that he is running the world, not the idol worship that they were participating in, and that they had to be raised up to a higher level. So therefore, let us create man and woman, that tend to be expressions which Hashem created the world. is equivalent to the plague of Dam, blood, and the 10th one, Makos Buchoros, killing of the firstborn Egyptians, which we'll have more to say about next week, is equivalent to Bereshit Elokim Hashemayim Va'aretz. In other words, again, life and death, the whole existence of the human race is dependent on God, and therefore the world had to be shown the high level of power, God's total dominance. And then there's all connection to the Aseros Adibros. It's called the 10 Commandments in English. Literally, this is 10 words, starting with the first one being, "Am Hashem your God who took you out of Egypt, out of the house of oppression." And that is equivalent to Reshit Elokim et Hashemayim Va'aretz. Why? Because that shows that the whole purpose of Hashem's world was not only to create it, which was also done with the Torah, but the world should be governed by the principles set up by God. The 10th of the saying was, "Thou shalt not covet nations, your neighbor's wife, neighbor's behemoths, animals, any property." You shouldn't be having desires for everything. A fundamental lesson being taught there, of course, is that what we have or what we don't have is all part of Hashem's divine design, and we're supposed to be satisfied with what we've been given and not look and see what everybody else has and desire more, which can lead, among other things, to rampant materialism. And that is so that was the reason. Now, looking at the 10 plagues, I'd like to focus on one of them. There is connections, there's interesting stuff to say about all of them in detail, but I'm going to briefly speak about the plague of blood. Now, that reflects the duality of each one of these plagues. It had two purposes. One purpose was to start elevating the people, Jewish people, into a concept of Hashem's being all powerful and being there to save them. And also to teach the Egyptians that in defying God and not letting his people go, there was going to be very serious consequences, which were also going to be serve two purposes: to show God's strength, because otherwise he could have done everything in one plague and forced out the people, and also for divine punishment. Now, let's look a bit at the plague of Dam. What is Hashem showing us? Among other things, we're aroused to return to Hashem. And now that we're aroused to return to Hashem, we have to realize we can't get rid of ourselves or our base nature overnight. Now, there was a gradual building up process. So Hashem's telling us, wait, look, I'm going to relieve you from slavery. We must refine ourselves. We must confess and admit ourselves, our past and present life, before we continue to the higher future. We have to realize that sometimes we have to endure the spilling of our own blood. There's been many times throughout history when people have had to die al Kiddush Hashem, sacrificing their lives to Hashem. Now, this divine knowledge was tasted by the Egyptians, the waters of Hashem as blood. Jewish people tasted the blood as water, as divine benevolence. So we see this dichotomy and this double purpose, which is focusing on all of the plagues. The other issue is that look where it attacked. It attacked the Nile. It attacked the Nile, and what was the Nile? The Nile River was the basis of all of the agriculture of Egypt. The water flooded over the delta, and that's where the Egyptians grew their produce. Interestingly enough, Pharaoh said that he made the Nile rise and fall. He was like God. Why didn't Moshe confront him at the Nile for the first of the plagues? Because Pharaoh was trying to appear as a god, but of course, not being a god, he had to perform normal bodily functions to everybody else, but he was trying to conceal that. So he was challenged early in the morning. Beyond him being challenged that way, it also showed that even though his servants could duplicate turning some blood into water, they couldn't do it to the fullness. So all the Egyptians, and if the Egyptians tried seizing water from Bnei Israel, it turned to blood. And not only did this break the slavery once and for all, after that there was no more burdens on the Bnei Israel. The Egyptians had to pay to get the water so they wouldn't die of thirst during the first plague. They had to pay the Bnei Israel, and that was the down payment for all the forced labor and suffering they had inflicted on us for all of those years. And there's another even deeper suggestion here, idea here, that what was Pharaoh's overall plan? Pharaoh's overall plan was to keep us. He knew the ultimate plan was for Bnei Israel to go up and get the Torah, which we did at our Sinai level later on. And he was trying to stop that every way possible. As I spoke about last week, he tried to give the kill all the Jewish males because there had to be 600,000 people. And he was doing everything possible by the enslavement to prevent the Torah being given, the Bnei Israel being liberated, and to give it. And that is, by the way, as I explained, the connection between the Ten Commandments is because that's something that Pharaoh was trying to prevent by oppressing us. And he was going to try to stop history. And therefore he had to be shown not only could he not stop history, but he had no control even over his own country. Ultimately, Egypt's going to be devastated by the 10 plagues. And because he wanted to do the opposite of God, he wanted to bottle Bnei Israel from going up to receive the Torah. He was going to have 10 plagues imposed on him. And that was something he was educated. Another concept of why blood was the first plague, beyond the reasons I gave above, is that the Egyptians, first of all, used blood, often the blood of the slaves and their children. The Pharaoh, for example, used to like to bathe in blood from children of Bnei Israel. And they used, even without beyond that, they use it for all types of idol worship and all kinds of other unspeakable practices and of spiritual impurity, and therefore Mida Keneged Mida, what they were using for that, and upsetting it in Hashem's world. That's not what animals are supposed to be used, and blood is supposed to be revealed as the source of life, and that it comes from Hashem. They set that all upside down. In fact, we see this in all the plagues. They took what should have been a natural order and literally stood them on their head. And now what God's doing here is setting them back on their the way they're supposed to be. We'll be continuing in next week's Parshas Woe, on the last of the 3 plagues, and the actual liberation from Egypt. Anyway, good Shabbos and Shabbat Shalom.